Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the unbelievable downfall, and somehow even more unbelievable comeback, of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered Europe, lost it all, got sent to a tiny island, and then decided, very casually, that exile was more of a suggestion than a rule. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. When Napoleon Bonaparte arrives on Elba in 1814, you're supposed to believe this is the end of the story. The great conqueror of Europe has been defeated, politely asked to step down, and shipped off to a small Mediterranean island where, ideally, he will reflect on his life choices and maybe develop a healthy interest in gardening. And for a moment, you almost believe it too. On paper, everything looks perfect. Napoleon has abdicated. The wars are over. The coalition powers can finally relax without worrying that he's about to show up again with another army and a slightly improved strategy. Problem solved. Except, you're dealing with Napoleon. And sending Napoleon to Elba is less like locking a door and more like placing a very determined cat outside and hoping it doesn't immediately come back through the window. Because this is not a harsh exile. This is suspiciously comfortable. You arrive on an island with a palace, a personal guard of about 1,000 loyal soldiers, and just enough authority to keep calling yourself emperor, which is honestly a bold decision from the people who just defeated you. It's basically retirement, but with a title, a uniform, and the lingering feeling that you could absolutely ruin Europe again if given the chance. And here's where you start to notice the problem. You're not broken. You're bored. Elba is small. Very small. You can cross it in a day if you're motivated, or if you're Napoleon, which is essentially the same thing. There are only so many roads to fix, so many administrative reforms to implement, and only so many times you can reorganize a tiny island before you realize this is not enough. Still, you try. You rebuild roads. You restructure the economy. You act like a responsible ruler of a miniature kingdom, as if this is your life now. But let's be honest, you're not built for miniature. You're built for armies, empires, and dramatic entrances. And then there's the biggest issue of all. They didn't send you far enough. Elba sits right there in the Mediterranean, uncomfortably close to everything you used to control. Close enough to hear rumours, close enough to receive letters, close enough to stay very, very informed, and you pay attention. You hear about France under Louis XVIII, the dissatisfaction, the tension, the quiet frustration building among soldiers and civilians alike. And suddenly, this peaceful retirement starts to feel less like a conclusion and more like an intermission. Because exile only works if you accept it. And you? You're already thinking about leaving. So here you are, officially exiled, technically defeated, supposedly finished. And yet, you wake up every morning still being called emperor, which is already a strong sign that this situation has not been fully thought through. On Elba, your life is meant to be controlled. There are watchers, there are agreements. There are very serious people in Europe who believe you are being closely monitored. And to be fair, you are. Just not very well. The British assign ships to keep an eye on you, which sounds impressive until you realise they are not watching you every second. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they get bored. Sometimes they assume you're busy reorganising road systems again and decide that's probably harmless. Which, to them, it is. To you, it's an opportunity. Because the truth is, this isn't prison. This is house arrest, with a coastline. You walk freely. You inspect troops. You meet visitors. You receive messages. You host dinners. You plan improvements. You exist in this strange middle ground where everyone pretends you're no longer dangerous, and you politely pretend to agree. Meanwhile, you're taking notes. You notice the routines, the gaps, the moments when no one is really paying attention. You observe who comes and goes, which ships are nearby, how often they change position. Not obsessively, just professionally. And while Europe relaxes, you do something deeply inconvenient for them. You stay sharp. You review past campaigns. You think about what went wrong. You replay decisions in your head, not with regret, but with calculation. Because you're not asking, why did I lose? You're asking, what would I do differently next time? And that question alone is already a problem. But then the news starts arriving. France is unstable. Under Louis XVIII, things are underwhelming. Soldiers are unhappy. Officers feel sidelined. The public is quietly losing patience. And suddenly, your exile feels less secure. Not because you're in danger, but because opportunity is getting closer. Because if France is dissatisfied, then France might be willing to listen. And if France is willing to listen, then you're no longer a prisoner. You're just temporarily elsewhere. At some point, you stop pretending this is permanent. You've fixed the roads. You've reorganized the island. You've inspected the troops so many times they could probably do it without you. There's nothing left here that matches the scale of what you used to be. And that's the problem, because you don't think small. You never have. So instead of settling into exile like a reasonable, defeated former emperor, which, let's be honest, was never really your brand, you start doing what you do best. You plan, quietly at first, casually, as if you're just thinking things through to pass the time. But the thoughts become more structured, more precise, less what if, and more when. Because now you have something you didn't have before. Information. News continues to reach Elba, and none of it is particularly encouraging for the new regime in France. Under Louis XVIII, things are shaky. The monarchy has returned, but it feels out of place. Like someone tried to restore an old painting over a wall that had already been rebuilt. The soldiers miss you. Which is a sentence that should worry absolutely everyone involved. Many of them had fought under you for years. They remember the victories, the promotions, the sense that they were part of something unstoppable. Now they're back under a king who didn't earn their loyalty in the same way. And soldiers, as it turns out, are not easily convinced by nostalgia alone. They want leadership. And you happen to specialize in that. So you start asking yourself a very dangerous question. What if you went back? Not in theory. Not someday. Soon. Because here's the thing. You don't need to conquer France again. You just need to walk into a situation where people are already unhappy and give them something to believe in. And the more you think about it, the less impossible it sounds. The island feels smaller. The idea feels bigger. And suddenly, exile doesn't feel like the end of your story. It feels like the setup, because while Europe believes you've been removed from the game, you're already studying the board. And this time, you're not planning a war. You're planning a return. By now, you're no longer adjusting to exile. You're running intelligence operations on a Mediterranean island with a population smaller than one of your former armies, which, honestly, feels much more on brand. Because while Europe is busy congratulating itself for finally getting rid of you, you're quietly building something far more dangerous than an army. Awareness. Messages begin to flow in and out of Elba. Not loudly, not officially, but steadily. Officers who once served under you find ways to communicate. Loyalists send updates. Visitors arrive with news that somehow feels a little too detailed to be casual conversation. And you listen, carefully, because every small detail matters. You hear about the army in France, how veterans feel overlooked, how promotions have slowed, how the new leadership doesn't inspire the same confidence. You hear about civilians growing frustrated, about policies that feel disconnected, about a king who is trying to restore the past in a country that has already moved on. You don't need everything to be perfect. You just need enough people to be dissatisfied. And from what you're hearing, that box is already checked. So you start organizing the information, not on paper, because that would be inconvenient if discovered, but in your head. Patterns, names, locations. Who might support you? Who might hesitate? Who would absolutely try to stop you the moment you step foot in France again? Because let's not pretend this is risk-free. If this fails, you're not going back to Elba. You're going somewhere much worse, somewhere colder. somewhere far enough away that even you couldn't casually drop by France again. So you calculate routes, timing, numbers. How many men would you need? Not to fight a war, but to survive long enough for something else to happen. Because your plan isn't built on force. It's built on something far more unpredictable. Loyalty. Or at least, the memory of it. And that's the real gamble. Because you're betting that when French soldiers see you again, they won't raise their rifles. They'll lower them. Which, if you think about it, is either genius, or the kind of idea that ends very quickly and very badly. But the more information you gather, the more confident you become. This isn't chaos, it's opportunity. And now, for the first time since arriving on Elba, you're no longer just thinking about escape. You're preparing for it. By now, you're not just thinking about escape, you're waiting. Because timing, for you, has always been everything. Battles are not won by strength alone. They're won by choosing the exact moment when your enemy is distracted, divided, or just slightly overconfident. And right now, Europe is all three. At the Congress of Vienna, the great powers of Europe are busy doing what they do best. Arguing. Borders, influence, titles, who gets what, who deserves more after defeating you. It's less a unified strategy, and more a very tense negotiation where everyone smiles politely while quietly disagreeing with everything. Which means one thing: no one is paying full attention to you. And that is exactly the kind of situation you thrive in. Because while they redraw maps in elegant halls, you're looking at a much simpler question. When is the worst possible moment for them? And the answer is obvious. Now. Because, think about it, you don't need Europe to be weak. You just need it to be busy. If they're united and focused, your return gets crushed immediately. If they're distracted, slow to react, and slightly confused about what's happening, you get time. And time is all you need. But timing isn't just about Europe. It's about France. And France is ready. You've heard enough. Soldiers are unhappy. Officers feel ignored. The monarchy under Louis XVIII is stable on the surface, but underneath, it's fragile. And fragile systems don't need a full invasion. They just need a push. So now the plan starts to feel real. Not distant, not hypothetical. Real. You begin narrowing things down. The route, the landing point, the number of men you'll take. Not too many. You don't want to look like an invading force, but not too few. You need enough presence to make an impression, enough to survive the first encounter, because everything depends on that first encounter. If the soldiers you meet open fire, this ends immediately. If they hesitate, everything changes, and somehow you're willing to bet everything on hesitation, which is either the most calculated risk you've ever taken, or the moment where confidence finally turns into something else. But you don't see it that way. You see a window, a narrow one, a dangerous one, but open. And after months of waiting, observing and planning, you decide it's time to leave the island. At some point, planning stops being theoretical and becomes very real. Late February 1815. You wake up on Elba knowing this is not going to be a normal day of inspecting roads and pretending you're retired. This is the day you leave, not quietly, not secretly in the way people expect, but decisively. Because if there's one thing you understand, it's this: hesitation kills momentum. And momentum is the entire plan. So, you move fast. You gather your loyal troops, around 1,000 men, veterans, soldiers who still believe in you, or at the very least believe that following you is more interesting than staying behind on an island doing maintenance work. You don't need a massive army. You just need enough men to look like something serious, and not enough to look like a threat worth immediately crushing. It's a delicate balance, and naturally you go for it anyway. Ships are prepared. Not a grand fleet, just a handful of vessels, including the brig Inconstant, which, if you think about it, is a very fitting name for what you're about to do. And then comes the moment where a reasonable person might pause. You don't. You board. Your men follow, and just like that, you leave. No dramatic prison break, no guards being overpowered, no elaborate disguise. You simply sail away from Exile as if this had always been part of the plan. Which, to be fair, it was. And the British ships that were supposed to be watching you? They miss it. Or they react too late. Or they assume that a former emperor calmly sailing away from his assigned island couldn't possibly be doing what it very obviously looks like he's doing. Because the idea is ridiculous. You, defeated, exiled, outnumbered, are heading back toward France. Not to negotiate, not to visit, but to take everything back. And from the outside, it makes no sense, which is exactly why it works. Why? Because while everyone else is still thinking in terms of what's reasonable, you're already moving in terms of what's possible. The island fades behind you. The sea stretches ahead. And for the first time since your exile began, you're no longer contained. You're in motion. And once you're in motion, stopping you becomes a lot harder than anyone in Europe is about to realize. Now comes the part where your entire plan should fall apart. Because escaping Elba is one thing. Crossing the Mediterranean without being intercepted is another. This is not an empty sea. It's watched, patrolled, controlled by the same powers that just spent years trying to get rid of you. The British Navy alone is enough to ruin your entire comeback before it even begins. And yet, you keep sailing, which means one of two things. Either you are incredibly lucky, or everyone else is incredibly unprepared. Probably both. Your small flotilla moves north, hugging routes that reduce the chance of being spotted. You're not charging forward like a conqueror. You're slipping through like a man who understands that getting caught now would end everything before it even starts. Because if a British ship intercepts you, this story becomes very short. Napoleon tried to escape. It didn't work. End of legend. But that doesn't happen. Instead, something almost absurd unfolds. Ships pass. Opportunities to be discovered come and go. And somehow, no one stops you. Part of it is speed. Part of it is timing. But a large part of it is something far more dangerous. Disbelief. Because even if someone did see you, would they immediately assume what you were doing? A former emperor calmly sailing back toward France with 1,000 men, planning to reclaim power? It sounds insane. And people tend to underestimate things that sound insane, which, for you, is incredibly convenient. On board, your men are quiet, focused. They know what's at stake. There's no guarantee of success, no promise of reinforcements, just a shared understanding that they are either about to make history or disappear into it. And you remain calm, because this part, the movement, the risk, the narrow escape, that's familiar territory. You've gambled before. You've taken risks that didn't make sense on paper. And more often than not, they worked. So you keep going. The coastline of France draws closer. Every mile increases the stakes. Every hour reduces the chance of turning back. Not that turning back was ever really an option. Because once you left Elba, this stopped being an escape. It became a return. And now, as the land begins to appear on the horizon, you're about to find out whether your greatest gamble is about to pay off, or collapse the moment your boots touch French soil. Eventually the coastline appears, and just like that, this stops being a bold idea, and becomes a very real problem. You land near Golfe Juan on March 1st, 1815. No Grand Armada, no overwhelming force. Just you, 1,000 men, and a plan that relies almost entirely on other people not shooting you. Which, when you say it out loud, is not exactly comforting. Because let's be clear, you are not invading France. You are walking into it. And technically, France is not on your side. There is a king. There is an army. There are orders, very clear orders, to stop you, immediately. Preferably before this turns into something embarrassing for everyone involved. So the moment you step onto French soil, everything changes. The safety of the sea is gone. The island is far behind you. And now every step forward increases the chance that this ends in a very short and very final confrontation. But you don't hesitate. Of course you don't. Instead of heading straight to Paris along the obvious coastal routes, where royalist forces are stronger and more organised, you make a decision that feels less dramatic, but far more intelligent. You go inland, through the mountains. It's slower, harder, less predictable, which is exactly why you choose it. Because this isn't about arriving quickly, it's about arriving alive. The route you take will later be known as the Route Napoleon, which sounds impressive now, but at the time, it's just a difficult path through terrain that gives you one advantage: control. Fewer troops, fewer checkpoints, fewer chances for a large, organised force to block you before your plan has a chance to unfold. And that's the key. Because your success doesn't depend on winning battles. It depends on avoiding them, at least at the beginning. You march with your men, not as an invading army, but as something far more confusing: a returning emperor, which is not a category most soldiers are trained to deal with. And as you move forward, word begins to spread. You've landed. You're marching. You're coming back. And somewhere ahead, French troops are preparing to meet you, to stop you, to end this before it gets out of control. Which means the next encounter will decide everything, because if they fire, this story ends here. But if they don't, then what you're doing stops looking impossible and starts looking inevitable. This is it. The part where your plan is supposed to collapse in a very loud, very final way. As you move inland from Golfe Juan, word spreads faster than you do. Royal troops are mobilized. Orders are issued. Stop Napoleon. Arrest him. End this immediately before it turns into something much worse. Which, to be fair, it already is. And eventually, it happens. Near Grenoble, you come face to face with soldiers sent specifically to stop you. Armed, organised, loyal, at least on paper, to Louis XVIII. This is the moment. No more movement. No more planning. No more careful positioning. Just you and them. And logically, this is where it ends. Because they have orders. They have numbers. They have every reason to open fire the moment they see you. So what do? You walk forward. Alone. No shield. No dramatic backup plan. No hidden strategy waiting to activate. You just walk. Which is either the most confident move in history or the fastest way to get yourself shot. Your men watch. The soldiers watch. Everyone is waiting for the same thing. The first gunshot that will decide how this ends. And instead of stopping at a safe distance, you get closer. Then closer. Until there is no space left for uncertainty. You open your coat. And you say the line that should not work, but somehow does. If any of you would shoot your emperor, here I am. Now let's pause for a second. Because from a rational perspective, this is absurd. You are unarmed, outnumbered, technically an outlaw, standing in front of men who have been ordered to arrest or kill you, and your strategy is emotional pressure, which should fail immediately. But it doesn't. No one fires, not a single shot. The silence stretches. Seconds feel longer than they should. You're standing there, fully exposed, waiting to see if your entire plan ends in this exact moment. And then something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. The soldiers hesitate. And hesitation is everything. Because hesitation turns certainty into doubt. Doubt turns orders into questions. And questions are where you thrive. Because in that moment, they're no longer just seeing an enemy, they're seeing you, their former commander, their emperor, the man many of them once followed into battle. And suddenly, pulling the trigger isn't so simple anymore. Which means your gamble, your entire plan, has just survived its most dangerous test. Not because you fought, but because no one did. So, no one shoots you, which, considering the situation, is already a massive overachievement. But what happens next is even more ridiculous. Because instead of arresting you, the soldiers start joining you. At first, it's subtle. A few men lower their weapons. A few step forward. There's hesitation, confusion, that awkward moment where everyone is waiting to see who moves first, like a very tense social situation, except with rifles and the future of France at stake. And then it happens. One soldier steps forward, then another. And just like that, the entire dynamic shifts. The unit sent to stop you becomes part of your army, which is not how this is supposed to work. Orders were clear. The mission was simple. And yet, here you are, gaining strength from the very forces meant to destroy you. You don't celebrate. Of course you don't. You expected this, or at least you hoped for it with an unreasonable level of confidence, because your plan was never about overpowering France. It was about reconnecting with it. And now it's working. Word spreads quickly, faster than before. Not just that you've landed, but that troops are switching sides. That resistance is optional. That this situation is no longer under control. And that changes everything. Because now, every unit sent to stop you faces the same problem. Do they follow orders, or do they follow you? And the more men who join you, the easier that decision becomes. Momentum builds. Not through force, through belief. Which is far more dangerous. Your small force begins to grow, from hundreds to thousands. Officers who once served under you return. Veterans recognize familiar faces, familiar commands, familiar confidence. It feels familiar, which is exactly what you want, because familiarity lowers resistance, and resistance is the only thing standing between you and Paris. Meanwhile, back in the royal court, the situation is starting to look less like a minor inconvenience and more like a full-scale crisis, because you're not being stopped, you're being welcomed. And that's the real problem. Because an invasion can be crushed, a rebellion can be contained, but a leader being re-accepted by his own army? That's something much harder to control, and as you continue marching north, one thing becomes very clear. You are no longer a risk. You are a movement, and movements are very difficult to stop once they start. At this point, things stop feeling risky and start feeling inevitable, which for you is always a good sign, and for everyone else, a very bad one. Because what began as a small, almost absurd march from Golfe Juan is now turning into something much larger. With every mile you move north, your force grows. Not through recruitment posters or dramatic speeches, but through something far more powerful. Recognition. Soldiers don't need convincing. They already know who you are. They've marched under you, fought for you, survived with you. And now, as you appear again, not defeated, not broken, but confident as ever, it feels less like a rebellion, and more like a continuation. So they join, one unit at a time, then several, then entire groups who decide, almost collectively, that opposing you is both difficult and slightly pointless. And just like that, your army multiplies, from 1,000 men to several thousand, to something that starts to look dangerously close to a real force again. And here's the part that makes this even more uncomfortable for your enemies. You're still not fighting. There are no major battles, no dramatic clashes, no moments where you have to prove your strength in the traditional sense, because you don't need to. Every time someone chooses not to resist you, your position becomes stronger. Every time someone switches sides, your return feels more legitimate. And legitimacy is everything, because now, this isn't just a man escaping exile. This is a leader being restored. And that changes how people think. It changes how officers react, how civilians talk, how news spreads. Suddenly, you're not just advancing, you're being anticipated, expected. Meanwhile, the monarchy under Louis XVIII is starting to feel the pressure. Because this isn't happening slowly, it's accelerating. And acceleration is dangerous, because the faster this grows, the less time there is to respond. Orders become outdated before they can be executed. Troops sent to stop you arrive only to discover there's nothing left to stop, just more men joining your side. And the snowball keeps rolling, bigger, faster, harder to control. Until eventually, it becomes clear to everyone watching, supporters and enemies alike, that this is no longer a question of if you will reach Paris, but what happens when you do. And by now, even your enemies are starting to realize something deeply uncomfortable. This isn't collapsing. It's working. By now, the situation has moved beyond manageable. It has officially entered the category of this should not be happening, and yet here we are. In Paris, Louis XVIII is receiving updates that become increasingly uncomfortable with each passing day. At first, it's small things. Napoleon has landed. Napoleon is marching. Napoleon has encountered troops. All expected, all under control. And then the reports change. Napoleon is not being stopped. Napoleon is gaining support. Napoleon is being joined, which is not part of the plan. Because the entire strategy relied on one very simple assumption, that French soldiers would remain loyal to the crown, that they would follow orders, that they would treat Napoleon as a threat, not a returning leader. And that assumption is now collapsing, fast. Units sent to intercept you are not reporting victories. They're not even reporting resistance. They're reporting confusion, hesitation, and in some cases, complete silence, which in military terms is rarely a good sign, because silence usually means one of two things. They've been defeated, or they've switched sides. And in your case, it's increasingly the second option. Back in Paris, the atmosphere shifts. What was once dismissed as a minor disturbance is now clearly something much bigger. Advisors begin to panic, quietly at first, then less quietly. Plans are suggested, troops are repositioned, orders are rewritten, but none of it feels effective. Because how do you stop someone who isn't being resisted? How do you defend against an advance that isn't really an attack? That's the problem. You're not breaking through defences, you're passing through them. And every new report makes that more obvious. Napoleon is closer. Napoleon has more men. Napoleon is still not facing significant opposition. At some point, the realization becomes unavoidable. This is not a rebellion that can be crushed. This is a return that is being allowed. And that changes everything. Because now, the king isn't just dealing with a military problem, he's dealing with a psychological one. If the army won't fight you, then the army is no longer his. And if the army is no longer his, then Paris isn't secure. And if Paris isn't secure, then his position isn't either. Which leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion. You are not just approaching the capital, you are replacing him. And for the first time since you left Elba, the balance of power has fully shifted. Not because you forced it, but because no one stopped you. At some point, denial stops working. In Paris, Louis XVIII has run out of reassuring explanations. The reports are no longer vague, no longer delayed, no longer optimistic. They are direct, consistent, and deeply inconvenient. Napoleon is coming. Napoleon is not being stopped. Napoleon is being joined. Which means one thing. This is over. Not officially, not ceremonially, but practically. Because power, as it turns out, depends heavily on people actually defending it. And right now, the people who are supposed to defend the king are reconsidering their options. And when your army starts reconsidering, your throne becomes more of a suggestion than a guarantee. So the mood in Paris shifts. Quickly. What was once a confident royal court becomes a place of quiet urgency. Conversations grow shorter. Decisions happen faster. There's less debate and more acceptance, because everyone can see what's coming. You are approaching, and not as a defeated exile, but as something far more complicated. A returning ruler, which is frankly not a situation any restoration monarchy is trained to handle. So the king does the only thing left to do. He prepares to leave. Not dramatically, not with a final stand or a last speech. There is no heroic moment here, no defiant gesture to rally support. Because rallying support requires people willing to rally, and those people are currently marching toward you. So instead, it becomes a quiet withdrawal. Carriages are arranged, plans are made. The court begins to thin out as officials decide, individually, that being somewhere else might be a better long-term strategy. And then, finally, he goes. Louis XVIII leaves Paris, heading north toward safety, leaving behind a capital that is no longer his to control. And just like that, the throne is empty. No battle, no siege, no dramatic confrontation, just absence, which, in this case, is more powerful than resistance. Because when a ruler leaves before the fight even begins, it sends a very clear message. The fight is already lost. And for you, this is the moment everything locks into place. The final barrier is gone. There is no army left to stop you. No authority left to oppose you. Just a city waiting. And as you continue your march, it becomes undeniable, even to those who once doubted it. You're not chasing power anymore. Power is waiting for you. By the time you approach Paris, there's no tension left, no uncertainty, no dramatic will he or won't he moment. Because at this point, everyone already knows the answer. You will. The road to the capital feels different now. Not dangerous, not contested, just open. The same France that weeks ago was supposed to stop you at the coast has instead guided you all the way to its heart, which is both impressive and deeply embarrassing for everyone who said this wouldn't happen. As you move closer, the atmosphere shifts again, but this time it's not fear, it's anticipation. People gather, soldiers wait. Officials prepare themselves for what comes next, not to resist it, but to adapt to it. Because when a situation becomes inevitable, resistance tends to quietly disappear. And that's exactly what's happened. You enter Paris on March 20th, 1815. No battle, no siege, no last-minute defense of the city. Just you, walking back into power. Which, historically speaking, is not how most overthrown rulers make their return. There are no barricades, no desperate clashes in the streets, no final loyalists trying to hold the line for a king who has already left. Because there is no line. It dissolved somewhere between the coast and the capital. And now, all that's left is the outcome. You arrive at the Tuileries Palace, the same place you once ruled from, the same place you were forced to leave, and step back into it as if the past year was just a slightly inconvenient interruption. Which, from your perspective, it basically was. The soldiers greet you, the people watch, and just like that, you are emperor again. Not because you conquered the city, but because no one stopped you from taking it, and that's what makes this moment so unusual. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no decisive battle, no overwhelming force, no grand display of military power. Just movement, momentum, and a series of decisions, mostly made by other people, not to resist, which, in the end, is all you needed. Because your return wasn't built on strength alone. It was built on timing, confidence, and the very human tendency to hesitate at the exact wrong moment. And as you stand once again in control of France, one thing becomes clear. You didn't just escape exile, you reversed it, completely. And for a brief, almost unbelievable moment, it worked. And just like that, you've done it. You escaped exile, crossed the sea, walked through your own country without being stopped, and took back the throne without fighting a single major battle. Which, if you step back for a moment, sounds less like a historical event and more like something that should have been rejected in the first draft for being too unrealistic. And yet, here you are, emperor again. But now comes the part that's slightly less satisfying, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a very short, very intense final chapter, what history would later call the 100 Days. And here's the problem. Europe is no longer distracted. Back at the Congress of Vienna, the arguments stop, the disagreements pause, because suddenly everyone has something much more important to focus on. You, again. And this time, they are not underestimating you. They don't debate whether you're a threat. They assume it. Immediately. Armies are mobilized, plans are drawn, alliances are reinforced. The same powers that once struggled to coordinate now move with a single shared goal. End this. Properly. This time. And you know it. Of course you do. Because your return was never about long-term stability. It was a gamble. A brilliant one. But still a gamble. You didn't come back because it was safe. You came back because it was possible. And for a moment, a brief, almost absurd moment, you proved that possibility was enough. You bent reality just far enough to walk back into power. But reality has a way of correcting itself, and it's already starting to. Because while France has accepted you, Europe has not, and Europe is coming. Still, none of that takes away from what you've done, because escaping exile is one thing. Anyone can run, but you didn't just escape. You returned. You convinced an entire army not to fight you. You convinced a nation to accept you again. You turned hesitation into victory, and for that short stretch of time, you pulled off something that almost no one else in history has managed. You lost everything, and then simply walked back and took it again, which is either the greatest comeback of all time or the most confident mistake ever made. Probably both. And that's what makes your escape so extraordinary. Not the distance, not the ships, not even the risk, but the fact that you didn't just leave exile behind. You made the world act like it had never happened. You don't find a medieval bestiary. It finds you. Picture this. A cold stone monastery, somewhere far from anything resembling comfort. The air smells faintly of ink, wax, and damp wool. A monk sits hunched over a wooden desk, his back already permanently bent by years of copying words that, frankly, no one alive today would fact-check. And yet, this is important work, because what he's writing isn't just a book. It's the book, a guide to understanding the entire universe, through animals. Welcome to the medieval bestiary. At first, you think you understand what's going on. There are lions, sure, wolves, dogs, deer, creatures you could, in theory, encounter without immediately questioning your sanity. But then, just as you start to feel confident, the page turns, and suddenly there's a unicorn. Not metaphorically, just there, casually existing, as if everyone agreed this was normal. And that's your first mistake. Expecting logic. In this world, animals are not just animals. They are symbols, lessons, walking, roaring sermons. The lion isn't important because it's real. It's important because it represents Christ. The pelican? It pierces its own chest to feed its young with blood. Is that biologically accurate? Absolutely not. Is it spiritually meaningful? Apparently, yes. And that's all that matters. You're not reading science. You're reading meaning disguised as nature. Even the most ordinary creature comes with a hidden message. A fox isn't just clever. It's deceit itself, lurking in the grass like a medieval cautionary tale. A dog isn't just loyal. It's the embodiment of faithfulness. Every animal is watching you, judging you, silently asking, "So, which one are you?" And then there are the others, the ones that shouldn't exist. Dragons coil through the pages, massive and terrible. Manticores grin at you with human faces. Basilisks kill with a glance, which is deeply inconvenient if you enjoy using your eyes. These creatures aren't treated as myths. They are presented with the same calm authority as a goat or a horse. Because to the medieval mind, the world is not divided into real and imaginary. It is divided into meaningful and meaningless. And everything in this book, every claw, wing and scale, means something. So as you turn the page, don't ask whether these creatures are real. Ask what they're trying to tell you. Because in this world, the animals aren't just being described, they're describing you. You begin, naturally, with the king. Not your king, not the one taxing you into mild despair. No, this is the lion, the undisputed ruler of the bestiary, confidently strutting into the manuscript like it owns not just the forest, but also your moral development. And honestly, it does. At first, the lion seems familiar enough. Strong, noble, majestic. The kind of animal that would absolutely refuse to make eye contact with you if you encountered it in the wild. But the medieval version comes with enhancements. 3, to be exact. First, the lion erases its tracks with its tail. Why? To avoid being hunted. Practical? Maybe. Symbolic? Definitely. This is Christ evading the devil, apparently. So next time you see a big cat casually sweeping the ground behind it, just know you're witnessing divine metaphor in action. Second, the lion sleeps with its eyes open, which, if you think about it, is either deeply spiritual or deeply unsettling. According to the bestiary, this represents watchfulness, eternal vigilance, the idea that even in rest, something greater is always aware. You, meanwhile, can barely stay awake during a short video. And then comes the third trait, the one that truly elevates things from interesting animal fact to this escalated quickly. Lion cubs, according to the bestiary, are born dead. Yes, completely lifeless, no movement, no breath, just lying there until the father arrives. After 3 days, the lion breathes onto the cubs' faces, and suddenly they come to life. Now, if this sounds familiar, congratulations. You've just encountered one of the least subtle metaphors in medieval literature. This is not about lions. This is about resurrection, about death, waiting, and divine breath restoring life. And just like that, the lion is no longer just an animal. It's a sermon with fur. What's fascinating isn't whether people truly believed this. Some probably did, others likely didn't care. Because belief wasn't the point. Meaning was. The lion didn't need to be scientifically accurate. It needed to be spiritually useful. Its job wasn't to describe the natural world. It was to interpret it. So as you read, you start to understand the rules of this strange universe. Truth isn't what you can observe. Truth is what you can learn. And if that requires a lion casually resurrecting its children, then so be it. After all, in this book, reality is negotiable. But symbolism, that's non-negotiable. Just when you think you've adjusted to lions casually resurrecting their children, the bestiary decides to test your sanity again. Enter the unicorn. Now you might be expecting something elegant, graceful, maybe glowing slightly, like it has excellent skincare. And yes, the unicorn is beautiful, but that's not really the point. The point is that you will never catch it. Not with traps, not with weapons, not with your medieval-level decision-making skills, because the unicorn cannot be hunted. Unless you cheat. Here's how it works. The unicorn is wild, untamable, and extremely suspicious of literally everything, except one thing. A maiden. A pure, untouched woman, placed gently in the forest, like some kind of morally symbolic bait. And the moment the unicorn sees her, it just walks over. No hesitation. No dramatic chase sequence. It simply lays its head in her lap, completely calm, as if this is a totally reasonable life choice. And that's when the hunters strike. Yes, that escalated quickly. Now, before you start judging the unicorn for what is clearly a catastrophic lapse in judgment, remember, this is not about animal behavior. This is about meaning. The unicorn represents purity, strength, and something divine. The maiden represents innocence. Their meeting? That's symbolic of something much bigger, something spiritual, something sacred, something the medieval reader would nod at thoughtfully while you're still trying to process why this plan works at all. But here's where it gets interesting. In your world, vulnerability is a weakness. In theirs, it's a gateway. The unicorn is not stupid. It is choosing to be still, choosing to trust. And in doing so, it becomes both powerful and doomed, which, if you think about it, is uncomfortably relatable. Because the bestiary isn't just showing you a magical creature, it's showing you a pattern. The idea that what makes something pure also makes it vulnerable. That beauty and danger are often separated by about 5 seconds. And suddenly, the unicorn isn't just a mythical animal. It's a warning. Not about forests or hunters, but about trust, about desire, about the strange, quiet moments where instinct turns off and something else takes over. So as you turn the page, ask yourself something. If you were the unicorn, would you really walk away? Or would you step forward anyway, knowing exactly how this ends. Just in case you were starting to feel comfortable with unicorns making questionable life choices, the bestiary decides to remind you of something important. There is always a dragon, not somewhere far away, not in a distant mountain you can safely avoid. No, this dragon is everywhere, beneath the earth, coiled around trees, hiding in caves, rivers, deserts, waiting, always waiting. In the medieval bestiary, the dragon isn't just another creature. It's the creature, the largest, the strongest, the most feared. If the lion is the king, then the dragon is the problem, and not a small one. You're told it can crush animals with its tail, suffocate them in its coils, and guard treasures it has absolutely no practical use for. Which, if we're being honest, already feels like a personality issue. But again, this isn't about zoology. The dragon represents evil, not the cartoon kind, not the slightly misunderstood kind. No, this is pure, ancient, patient danger. The kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't need to, because it knows you'll come to it eventually. What's fascinating is how the bestiary describes its battles, especially with the elephant. Yes, the elephant. A creature that, in this world, represents innocence and purity. Large, peaceful, and apparently unaware that it's living in a book where dragons exist. The dragon attacks by ambush. It wraps itself around the elephant's legs, tightening, squeezing, dragging it down. The elephant falls, not because it's weak, but because it doesn't understand what it's facing. And that's the point. Evil doesn't always win because it's stronger. It wins because it's patient, because it studies, because it waits for the moment when you're not looking for it. And suddenly, the dragon isn't just a monster hiding in a cave. It's a presence. A constant tension running beneath everything in the bestiary. Every peaceful forest, every quiet river, every innocent creature. There's always the suggestion that something darker is nearby. Watching, waiting for the right moment to tighten its grip. You start to realize that in this world, danger isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar dramatically before attacking. It just appears. And by the time you notice it, it's already too late. So as you turn the page, you carry that with you. The quiet understanding that no matter how calm things seem, no matter how safe the setting feels, there's always something underneath. And it's been there the whole time. At this point, you've accepted a few things. Lions resurrect their children. Unicorns walk willingly into traps. Dragons are basically everywhere, quietly ruining lives. Fine. You've adjusted. And then the bestiary introduces something new. Something smaller. Something worse. The basilisk. Now, unlike the dragon, the basilisk doesn't need size, strength, or dramatic entrances. It doesn't coil around you or chase you through forests. It doesn't roar. It just looks at you. And you die. That's it. No struggle, no warning, just eye contact, and suddenly your day is completely ruined. The basilisk is often described as a small serpent, sometimes with a crown-like crest on its head, which is honestly a bold choice for something that kills everything it sees. A tiny king of destruction, wandering around with the confidence of something that knows it doesn't need to prove anything. Because it doesn't. Its power is effortless. And that's what makes it terrifying. You can't fight it. You can't outrun it. You can't even look at it. The moment your eyes meet, the story ends. Not gradually, not heroically, just over. Which naturally makes it perfect for symbolism. The basilisk represents deadly sin, not the loud, obvious kind, the kind that creeps in quietly, the kind you barely notice until it's already done its damage. Pride, envy, corruption. The things that don't need claws or teeth because they work from the inside. And like the basilisk, they don't attack you head-on. They wait for you to look at them. What's even more unsettling is how the bestiary describes the few ways to defeat it. One method involves a weasel, yes, a weasel, being sent into its lair. For reasons no one fully questions, the weasel is immune. It confronts the basilisk, and somehow, against all logic, wins. Another method? A mirror. You force the basilisk to look at itself, and it dies from its own gaze, which, if you think about it, is less of a battle and more of a deeply uncomfortable life lesson. Because suddenly, the basilisk isn't just a creature that kills with a glance. It's a reflection. The idea that some dangers don't come from outside, but from within. That sometimes the most destructive thing you can face is yourself. So as you turn the page, you might feel a little more cautious. Not about what's hiding in the shadows, but about what might be looking back at you. Among the grand beasts and supernatural terrors of the bestiary, the fox appears almost ordinary. No crown, no deadly gaze, no massive coils crushing elephants. Just a small, clever animal with reddish fur and sharp eyes. And yet, it might be one of the most dangerous creatures in the entire book, not because of strength, but because of deception. The fox is described as a master of trickery, a creature that survives not through power, but through performance. When it grows hungry, it does something unexpected. It lies down on the ground, stiff and motionless, as if it were dead. It slows its breathing, lets its body go limp, and waits. Birds, seeing what appears to be a harmless carcass, gather around it. They peck, they circle, they let their guard down. And then, in a single sudden movement, the fox springs to life. Too late. The deception is complete. In the medieval bestiary, this behaviour is not just an observation of animal cunning. It is a moral lesson, carefully constructed and deliberately unsettling. The fox represents deceit, specifically the kind that disguises itself as something harmless, even lifeless. It is falsehood wearing the mask of innocence. What makes the fox particularly effective is not just the trick itself, but the patience behind it. There is no rush, no reckless attack. The fox waits for the exact moment when its prey feels safest, when suspicion fades, when curiosity replaces caution. Only then does it act. This, to the medieval mind, was a powerful warning. Danger does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with claws bared or teeth exposed. Sometimes it lies still, sometimes it invites trust. And by the time the truth is revealed, the outcome is already decided. The fox becomes more than an animal. It becomes a pattern of behaviour, a symbol of manipulation, of carefully constructed illusions. It reflects a world where appearances cannot be trusted, where what seems harmless may conceal intent, and where the greatest threat is often the one that does not move at all. In a book filled with dragons and basilisks, the fox stands out for a different reason. It does not rely on fear. It relies on belief, and that perhaps is far more effective. Not every creature in the bestiary exists to deceive, destroy, or quietly ruin everything. Some exist to sacrifice. The pelican enters the manuscript with an air of quiet purpose. At first glance it seems unremarkable. A water bird, long-beaked, drifting along rivers and shores. Nothing about it suggests danger, trickery, or supernatural power. And then the story begins. According to the bestiary, the pelican's young are not always obedient. In fact, they are described as striking their parent, wounding it in a moment of wild defiance. The response is immediate and severe. The pelican, in a burst of anger, kills its own offspring. A brutal image. But the story does not end there. After 3 days, the mother returns. Standing over the lifeless bodies of her young, she does something extraordinary. She pierces her own breast with her beak, drawing blood, and lets it fall onto them, and they rise. Life restored through sacrifice. In the medieval imagination, this was not a strange or contradictory tale. It was a profound symbol. The pelican became an image of redemption, of love expressed through suffering, of life given so that others might live again. It is not subtle. The 3 days, the blood, the restoration. Every detail carries weight, echoing a larger narrative that medieval readers would have immediately recognized. The pelican is no longer just a bird. It becomes a living metaphor, a a quiet reflection of sacrifice at the center of their worldview. What makes this story striking is not just its symbolism, but its emotional contrast. The same creature that destroys also restores. The same force that brings death becomes the source of life. There is no attempt to separate the two. They are part of the same cycle. In this way, the pelican differs from many other creatures in the bestiary. It does not deceive like the fox or dominate like the lion. It embodies something more complex, a tension between justice and mercy, between consequence and forgiveness. Its power lies not in strength or fear, but in what it is willing to give up. And that idea lingers, because in a world filled with monsters and hidden dangers, the pelican introduces something quieter, but no less powerful, the possibility that loss can be undone, that death is not always final, and that the cost of restoration is often deeply personal, a creature that wounds, suffers, and gives, and in doing so, brings life back into the story. In a bestiary filled with predators, tricksters, and creatures of supernatural terror, the elephant stands apart. It is not cunning like the fox. It does not kill with a glance like the basilisk. It does not lurk beneath the surface like the dragon. It is large, calm, steady, and in a way that feels almost unfair, it is also vulnerable. The medieval elephant is described as a creature of great strength and gentle nature. It does not attack without reason. It does not deceive. It moves slowly, deliberately, as if aware of its place in the world. There is a quiet dignity to it, a sense that it exists without malice. But then comes the detail that defines everything. When an elephant falls, it cannot get back up. Not easily, not alone. According to the bestiary, if an elephant collapses, whether from exhaustion, injury, or age, it remains on the ground, unable to lift itself. Its massive body becomes its greatest weakness. Strength turns into burden, and so it waits. Other elephants gather around it. They try to help, pushing, lifting, straining with all their effort, but even they cannot raise it. The fallen one remains where it is, trapped between strength and helplessness, until something unexpected happens. A smaller elephant, a younger one, approaches. It kneels beside the fallen giant and uses its tusks to gently lift it, restoring it to its feet. Only then can it stand again. This image, like so many in the bestiary, carries meaning far beyond the animal itself. The elephant becomes a symbol of humanity, strong, dignified, but not self-sufficient, capable of great things, yet vulnerable to collapse. And when that fall comes, it cannot recover alone. What stands out is not just the fall, but the necessity of help. The idea that strength does not eliminate dependence, that even the greatest among creatures requires something outside itself to rise again. In the medieval imagination, this was not a weakness to be hidden. It was a truth to be understood. The elephant does not deceive. It does not pretend to be something it is not. Its story is simple, almost quiet compared to the drama of dragons and basilisks. But its lesson is no less powerful. Strength is not the absence of need, and rising again is rarely a solitary act. So in a world filled with creatures that threaten, deceive, or sacrifice, the elephant offers something different. A reminder that even the strongest can fall, and that sometimes it takes something smaller to lift them back up. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. The lion was never just a lion. The unicorn was never just a creature of the forest. The dragon, the basilisk, the fox, the pelican, the elephant, each one carried something beyond flesh and bone. The bestiary was never about animals. It was about interpretation. Every page builds toward this quiet realization. The medieval world did not separate nature from meaning. There was no clear line between what existed and what it represented. A creature did not need to be real to be true. It only needed to teach. And that changes everything. Because once that idea takes hold, the entire world becomes readable. The forest is no longer just trees and animals. It is a text. The creatures within it are not random. They are deliberate. each one placed there with purpose, each one offering a lesson to those willing to see it. In this way, the bestiary becomes more than a book. It becomes a way of seeing. The lion teaches about power and resurrection, the unicorn about purity and vulnerability, the dragon about hidden danger, the basilisk about destruction from within, the fox about deception, the pelican about sacrifice, the elephant about dependence and restoration. Individually, they are stories. Together, they are a system, a framework for understanding the world, where every creature reflects a part of human experience, strength and weakness, trust and betrayal, life and death, sin and redemption. Nothing is neutral, everything carries weight. What is striking is how confidently this system is presented. There is no hesitation, no suggestion that these meanings might be uncertain or symbolic in a modern sense. To the medieval reader, this was reality, not in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more important way. A reality of meaning. And perhaps that is what makes the bestiary so enduring. Not the creatures themselves, but the idea behind them. The belief that the world is not silent, that it speaks constantly, through forms and patterns, through stories embedded in nature. It suggests that understanding the world is not just about observing it, but interpreting it. Looking beyond the surface, searching for significance in even the smallest detail. In the end, the bestiary does not ask whether these creatures are real. It asks something far more difficult. If everything around you carries meaning, are you paying attention? Because in this world, nothing exists without purpose. Not even you. For most of history, long-distance travel was less an adventure and more a calculated risk with a high chance of failure. Merchants did not romanticize the journey. They feared it. Roads were unpredictable, borders constantly shifting, and every mile carried the possibility of theft, betrayal, or sudden violence. A caravan could leave one city full of goods and never reach the next. Information moved slowly, trust even slower. Trade existed, but it was fragile. And then the Mongols arrived. Under Kublai Khan, something changed that few would have expected from a people known first for conquest. The vast network of trade routes stretching across Eurasia did not collapse under their rule. It stabilized. The Silk Road, once a loose collection of dangerous paths, began to function as something closer to a system. The Mongol Empire unified enormous territories under a single authority. Lands that had once been divided by competing rulers were now connected, not just politically, but practically. A merchant could travel across thousands of miles without constantly crossing hostile borders. And more importantly, those roads were protected. The Mongols understood something essential. Trade was power. Wealth did not only come from conquest, but from movement, of goods, of people, of knowledge. So they enforced order with the same intensity they had once used to expand their empire. Banditry was punished severely. Local officials were expected to maintain safe passage. Caravans could move with a level of security that had rarely existed before. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, a kind of enforced peace across the empire. It was not gentle, it was not forgiving, but it was effective. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could plan a journey with a reasonable expectation of arrival. And with that safety came something else: confidence. Traders began to travel farther. Goods moved more frequently. Cities along the Silk Road grew into thriving hubs, filled with languages, cultures, and unfamiliar faces. What had once been isolated regions were now part of a connected world. Not perfectly connected, not equally safe everywhere, but connected enough to matter. The roads had not changed physically. They were still long, harsh, and unpredictable in terrain. Deserts remained deserts. Mountains remained mountains. But the human factor, the greatest danger, had shifted. For a brief moment in history, the risk of the journey was no longer defined by chaos. It was managed. And that changed everything. Safety alone did not transform the Silk Road. control did. Before the Mongols, the routes across Eurasia were divided between countless rulers, each with their own laws, taxes, and expectations. A merchant travelling long distances had to constantly adapt. New currencies, new languages, new risks at every border. Trade was not just movement, it was negotiation over and over again. The Mongol Empire removed much of that fragmentation. Stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe, it became one of the largest continuous land empires in history. Under Kublai Khan and his relatives, different regions were governed separately, but still linked under a broader system. The result was not perfect unity, but something close enough to make a difference. For merchants, this meant fewer interruptions. Instead of crossing dozens of unstable frontiers, traders could move through vast territories with a shared administrative framework. Taxes were more predictable. Permissions were clearer. The journey became less about survival and more about logistics, and with that came efficiency. The Mongols introduced standardized practices that made travel smoother. Official passes, known as paisa, were issued to trusted individuals, allowing them to move freely and receive assistance along the way. These passes were more than documents. They were guarantees of authority, recognized across thousands of miles. Alongside this, a network of relay stations was established. These stations, placed at regular intervals, provided fresh horses, supplies, and rest for travellers. Messages could move rapidly across the empire, carried by riders who changed mounts at each station. Information, once slow and uncertain, began to travel with surprising speed. For merchants, this system offered something invaluable: predictability. Routes could be planned with greater precision. Supplies could be managed. Communication between distant regions improved. Trade was no longer just a series of disconnected journeys. It became part of a larger coordinated network, and as that network strengthened, so did the connections between cultures. Goods moved, of course: silk, spices, metals, textiles. But so did ideas, technologies, and beliefs. What began as a system for control gradually became a channel for exchange. The empire did not erase differences between regions, but it made those differences accessible, and that accessibility reshaped the Silk Road. It was no longer just a path between distant places. It became a bridge. With the roads secured and the empire connected, something began to change in the behaviour of those who used them. Merchants stopped thinking small. Before Mongol rule, most traders operated within limited ranges. Journeys were broken into segments, with goods passed from one group to another. A merchant in Central Asia might never see the lands where his goods ultimately ended up. Distance was not just physical, it was practical. But now, the scale expanded. Under the protection of the Mongol system, merchants began to travel farther than before, crossing entire regions that had once been considered too dangerous or too uncertain. The idea of a continuous journey, from East Asia to the Middle East, or even toward Europe, became increasingly possible. And with that possibility came ambition. Caravans grew larger, investments increased. Traders were no longer just moving goods. They were building networks. Partnerships formed across cultures and languages, linking distant markets into a shared system of exchange. Among those who took advantage of this new reality were travellers like Marco Polo, whose journey across Asia became one of the most well-known examples of long-distance travel during this period. While not every merchant travelled as far or as famously, his experience reflected a broader trend. Movement was expanding, but it was not just about distance. Merchants also adapted to the structure of the Mongol Empire. They learned to navigate its administrative systems, to use official passes, to rely on relay stations, and to operate within a framework that, while controlled, offered stability. This required skill. Trade was no longer just about buying and selling. It involved negotiation across cultures, understanding different customs, and managing relationships that extended far beyond a single region. A successful merchant needed to think beyond immediate profit and consider long-term connections. and those connections began to reshape entire cities. Trade hubs along the Silk Road became more diverse, more active, more complex. Markets filled with goods from distant lands. Languages mixed. New ideas appeared alongside familiar ones. The presence of foreign merchants became less unusual and more expected. This was not a sudden transformation. It was gradual, built through repeated journeys, growing trust, and expanding opportunity. But over time, the effect became clear. The Silk Road was no longer a chain of isolated exchanges. It was becoming a system driven by people willing to move further, risk more, and connect worlds that had once remained separate. As merchants began to travel farther, the places they passed through started to change. Cities along the Silk Road were no longer just stops on a difficult journey. They became destinations in their own right, places where trade did not simply pass through, but gathered, expanded, and transformed. Under Mongol rule, urban centres across Eurasia experienced a shift in purpose. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kanbalik grew into major hubs of exchange. They were no longer defined solely by their local economies, but by their position within a much larger network. Goods arrived from distant regions: silk from China, spices from India, glassware from the Middle East, metals and textiles from Europe. Markets became layered with unfamiliar items, each carrying a story from somewhere far beyond the horizon. But it was not just goods that arrived. People did. Merchants, translators, scholars, craftsmen, envoys, all moving along the same routes, often meeting in the same cities. These urban centres became places of interaction, where different languages were spoken side by side, and different customs existed in close proximity. This created a new kind of environment, not fully unified, but deeply connected. In these cities, trade required more than simple exchange. It required understanding. Contracts had to be negotiated across cultural lines. Agreements depended on trust between individuals who did not share the same background, religion, or language. And over time, systems developed to support this complexity. Caravanserais, large inns designed for travelling merchants, offered space for rest, storage, and negotiation. These were not just places to sleep. They were centres of activity, where deals were made, information was exchanged, and networks were strengthened. The presence of Mongol authority also played a role. While the empire did not erase local identities, it provided a layer of stability that allowed these cities to function consistently. Officials ensured order, maintained routes, and facilitated the movement of goods and people. The result was a shift in scale. These cities were no longer isolated points on a map. They became crossroads, places where different parts of the world intersected, not briefly but continuously, where the movement of goods was matched by the movement of ideas, and where local life was shaped by distant influences. Over time, this constant interaction left its mark. Architecture, language, food, and customs all began to reflect a blend of influences. The cities of the Silk Road were no longer defined by a single culture. They became something more complex, something shared. As goods moved across the Silk Road, something less visible travelled with them: ideas. Silk, spices, and precious metals may have filled the caravans, but they were never the only cargo. Every merchant, every traveller, every envoy carried something intangible: beliefs, knowledge, habits, stories. And under Mongol rule, those ideas began to move faster and farther than before. The stability of the empire did not just benefit trade. It allowed communication between distant cultures to happen more consistently. Scholars could travel, religious figures could preach, craftsmen could learn techniques from lands they had never seen before. The Silk Road became more than a trade network. It became a channel of exchange for thought itself. Religions spread along these routes, carried by those who believed in them. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. Each moved across regions, finding new followers, adapting to new environments. In cities shaped by trade, it was not unusual to find multiple faiths existing side by side, each brought by travellers from different parts of the world. This coexistence was not always peaceful, but it was real, and it reflected the broader nature of the Silk Road under Mongol rule, a space where interaction was constant, even when agreement was not. Alongside religion, knowledge also travelled. Medical practices, astronomical observations, engineering techniques, these did not remain confined to their regions of origin. They moved with those who understood them, passing from one culture to another, sometimes altered, sometimes preserved. Paper-making, for example, had spread westward from China centuries earlier, but under the Mongols, its use became even more widespread. Written communication expanded. Records could be kept, copied, and shared more easily. The flow of information accelerated. Even simple observations about crops, climates, or trade practices could influence distant regions. A technique developed in one part of the world might appear, years later, in another, adapted to new conditions. What made this possible was not just movement, but contact. The Silk Road created opportunities for interaction that had rarely existed on such a scale. People who would never have met before now found themselves in the same spaces, exchanging not just goods, but perspectives. And over time, this exchange began to shape societies. Ideas did not remain separate from trade. They became part of it. The value of a journey was no longer measured only in what was bought or sold, but in what was learned and carried forward. Because in this connected world, influence did not move in a single direction. It flowed both ways. By this point, the movement of goods and ideas might seem almost natural, but it wasn't. It depended on a system, one that had to be maintained constantly, enforced carefully, and understood by those who used it. Without that structure, the Silk Road would have returned to what it had always been: fragmented, risky, unreliable. The Mongols built something different. At the center of this system was control, but not in the chaotic sense of conquest. It was organized, intentional, designed to keep things moving. One of the most important elements was the Yam network, a chain of relay stations stretching across the empire. These stations were placed at regular intervals along major routes, each stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and shelter. Couriers could ride from one station to the next, changing mounts and continuing without delay. Messages that once took months could now move in weeks, sometimes faster. This network was not limited to official communication. Merchants and travellers with the right authorization could also benefit from it. With a paitsa, an official tablet or pass, they could access these stations, receive assistance, and move more efficiently across vast distances. It was a system built on recognition. A traveller carrying the proper credentials was not just an individual. They were part of a larger structure, acknowledged and supported across regions that might otherwise have been unfamiliar or hostile. Alongside this, the Mongols implemented systems of taxation and regulation that, while strict, were consistent. Traders knew what to expect. Fees were defined. Routes were maintained. Local authorities operated within a broader framework, reducing unpredictability. This consistency mattered. Trade does not thrive in uncertainty. It requires reliability, even if that reliability comes with strict rules. The Mongols provided that stability, not by removing control, but by standardizing it. There was also an understanding of value. The Mongol leadership recognized that merchants were not just individuals seeking profit. They were essential to the functioning of the empire. Their movement connected regions, supplied goods, and facilitated communication. As a result, they were often granted protection and privileges that would have been rare in other contexts. This did not make the system perfect. It was still dependent on enforcement, on the willingness of local officials to follow orders, and on the broader stability of the empire itself. But for a time, it worked. The Silk Road was not just a path across continents. It was an organized network. and that organization made everything else possible. For all its stability, the Silk Road under Mongol rule was never truly safe. It was safer. That distinction mattered. The Mongols reduced chaos, but they did not eliminate risk. The roads were still long, the terrain still unforgiving, and the journey still demanded endurance. Deserts stretched endlessly, where a single mistake could mean death by thirst. Mountain passes remained treacherous, with narrow paths and sudden storms turning travel into a test of survival. Nature did not recognize empire. And then there were the human risks that lingered beneath the surface. While banditry was punished harshly, it did not vanish completely. Some regions remained more difficult to control than others, especially at the edges of the empire. Authority weakened with distance, and in those spaces, danger could return quickly. A caravan might travel for weeks in relative security, only to encounter uncertainty as it moved farther from the centers of power. There were also political tensions. The Mongol Empire, despite its vast reach, was not entirely unified. Different regions were governed by different branches of the ruling family. While they shared a common origin, their interests did not always align perfectly. At times, these divisions created friction, subtle at first, but capable of affecting trade. Routes could shift, permissions could change. Stability, while present, was never guaranteed. And beyond all of this, there was another danger, one that did not arrive with weapons or visible force. Disease. As people and goods moved more freely across Eurasia, so did illness. The same networks that allowed trade to flourish also created pathways for contagion. What began in one region could travel rapidly to another, carried by caravans that connected distant populations. The Silk Road became not only a channel for exchange, but also for unintended consequences. This was not fully understood at the time, but the effects would become clear. Despite these risks, travel continued, because the benefits outweighed the dangers. Merchants accepted uncertainty as part of the journey. They adapted to changing conditions, planned carefully, and relied on the systems put in place by the Mongols. Experience became as valuable as goods, and knowledge of the routes was often the difference between success and failure. What emerges from this is a more balanced picture. The Silk Road under Mongol rule was not a perfect system of safety and order. It was a managed environment where risk was reduced but never removed. And that tension between opportunity and danger defined the experience of those who travelled it. A road made safer, but never safe. As goods, people, and ideas continued to move across the Silk Road, something subtle began to change. Distance started to lose its meaning, not physically. The journey was still long, still demanding, still measured in months or even years. But conceptually, the world began to feel more connected, more reachable than it ever had before. Under Mongol rule, regions that had once existed in relative isolation were now linked through repeated contact. A merchant in Central Asia could become familiar with markets in China. A traveller from Europe could reach the court of Kublai Khan. Information about distant lands no longer remained entirely distant. It circulated. This circulation created a shift in awareness. People began to understand that the world extended far beyond their immediate surroundings, not as an abstract idea, but as something tangible. Foreign goods were no longer rare curiosities. They became part of everyday trade. Stories of distant places were no longer isolated accounts. They were reinforced by multiple travellers, repeated and expanded over time. Knowledge accumulated, and with it came a sense of scale. The Silk Road did not erase differences between cultures, but it made those differences visible. It allowed people to encounter unfamiliar customs, languages and beliefs, sometimes directly, sometimes through the goods and ideas that arrived from afar. This exposure changed perspectives. A city was no longer just a local centre. It was part of a wider network. A merchant was no longer limited to nearby markets. Opportunities extended across regions. Even rulers began to think beyond their immediate territories, aware of the connections that linked distant lands. The world, while still vast, became more knowable. And that shift had consequences. It encouraged exploration. It supported curiosity. It created an environment where travel, though still difficult, became more purposeful. The idea of crossing continents was no longer unimaginable. It was increasingly practical. This was not globalization in the modern sense, but it was a step toward it, a moment where systems, stability, and movement combined to create something new, a connected world, not fully unified, but linked enough to function as a whole. And for those living within it, that connection reshaped how they saw their place in it. The Silk Road was no longer just a route, it was a perspective, one that made the world feel smaller, even as it remained vast. For a time, it all worked. The roads were safer. The empire was connected. Goods moved, ideas spread, and the world, at least across Eurasia, felt more linked than ever before. The Silk Road under Mongol rule became something rare in history, a system where distance, though still vast, no longer prevented exchange. But systems like this depend on one thing above all else: stability. And stability, especially across an empire this large, is never permanent. The Mongol Empire had been built through expansion, held together by authority, and maintained through careful control. But over time, that control began to weaken. Leadership changed, priorities shifted. The unity that once defined the empire slowly gave way to division. Different regions, once coordinated, began to act more independently. The shared structure that had supported trade started to fragment. As central authority declined, the systems that depended on it, protection, regulation, communication, became less reliable. Routes that had once been secure grew uncertain again. Local powers reasserted themselves. Borders, once stabilized, began to shift. And with that, the Silk Road changed. Not all at once. Gradually, merchants became more cautious. Journeys required new calculations, new risks. The predictability that had defined the earlier period faded. Trade did not disappear, but it lost the efficiency and scale that had made it so remarkable under Mongol rule. At the same time, other factors began to reshape global exchange. Maritime routes expanded. Sea travel, though still dangerous, offered new possibilities for long-distance trade. Goods that once moved primarily over land began to take different paths, bypassing sections of the Silk Road altogether. The centre of trade was shifting, and the overland routes, while still important, were no longer the only option. What remains is not just the story of a system that worked, but of one that revealed what was possible. For a brief period, the Silk Road under Mongol rule demonstrated that vast regions could be connected, that trade could move across continents with relative stability, and that different cultures could interact on a continuous scale. It did not last, but it did not need to, because its impact continued, influencing how later systems of trade and connection would develop. The roads did not disappear. They changed, and the world, once connected in that moment, would never return entirely to what it had been before. For centuries, the great trade routes across Eurasia had been built on exchange. Silk moved west, silver moved east. Ideas, beliefs, and technologies travelled in both directions, carried by merchants who acted less like conquerors and more like connectors. Even when empires rose and fell, the basic principle remained the same. Trade was a balance. But by the 18th century, that balance began to shift. The routes themselves had not disappeared. The networks once strengthened under Kublai Khan had long since evolved, expanding beyond land into powerful maritime systems. Ships now carried goods across oceans, linking continents more efficiently than caravans ever could. And yet, the logic of the Silk Road still lived on. Only now it was being used differently. European powers, particularly the British East India Company, found themselves facing a frustrating reality. Trade with China was not equal. Under the Qing dynasty, Chinese markets operated on their own terms. European goods were not in high demand, but Chinese goods, especially tea, were. This created a problem that could not be ignored. Silver. European traders were paying for Chinese goods almost entirely in silver, and over time, that flow became one-sided. Wealth was leaving Europe and entering China at a scale that began to worry policymakers and merchants alike. Trade, once balanced, was now draining. An imbalance creates pressure. The solution that emerged was not immediate, but it was deliberate. If Europe could not find something China wanted, it would introduce something China could not easily resist. That something was opium, produced in large quantities in British-controlled India. Opium became the key to reversing the flow of silver. It was not originally part of traditional large-scale trade networks. It was introduced into them, gradually at first, then with increasing intensity. At first, it seemed like just another commodity, another product moving along familiar routes. But it was different. Unlike silk or spices, opium did not simply satisfy demand. It created it. Its effects ensured that once it entered a market, it did not leave easily. What began as a trade solution quickly became something more complex, more dangerous. The routes that once connected cultures were now being used to reshape them, and as the volume of opium increased, so did the consequences. Trade was no longer just about exchange. It was becoming a tool, one that would transform entire societies and lead to conflict that could no longer be avoided. Once opium entered the system, it did not remain a minor trade item for long. It spread. At first, its presence in China was limited, controlled, almost incidental. Opium had existed before, used in small quantities for medicinal purposes. It was not new. What was new was scale and intent. The British East India Company did not stumble into this trade. It organised it. In British-controlled India, particularly in regions like Bengal, opium production was expanded, regulated and standardised. Farmers were encouraged, often pressured, to grow poppies instead of food crops, tying local economies directly to the demands of global trade. This was not organic demand. It was engineered supply. From India, the opium was transported by sea to the Chinese coast, where it entered a complex network of smugglers and intermediaries. Officially, the Qing dynasty had banned the substance. The state recognized the danger early and attempted to control it, but prohibition created opportunity. Foreign merchants could not legally sell opium in Chinese ports, so they adapted. Ships anchored offshore. Transactions were conducted in secret. Chinese traders took the risk of transporting the drug inland, where demand was beginning to grow, and that demand did not need much encouragement. Opium's effects were immediate and powerful. It created dependence, and dependence created repeat consumption. What had once been a controlled substance became a habit, and then, for many, a necessity. The market expanded rapidly. Silver, which had once flowed steadily into China, began to reverse direction. Chinese consumers now paid for opium with the same currency that had previously supported their economy. The imbalance that had troubled European traders was being corrected, but at a cost that extended far beyond economics. What made this trade particularly effective was its structure. The British did not need to distribute opium directly across China. They only needed to ensure its steady arrival at the coast. From there, local networks handled the rest. The system sustained itself, driven by profit and reinforced by addiction. And as it grew, it became harder to control. The Qing government issued edicts, enforced bans, and attempted to limit the spread. But the combination of foreign supply and internal demand proved difficult to contain. Corruption within local administrations further weakened enforcement, allowing the trade to continue despite official opposition. This was no longer a simple exchange of goods. It was a cycle. Production fed supply. Supply fed demand. Demand fed profit. And profit ensured that the system would continue. The Silk Road, in its earlier form, had connected distant worlds through mutual interest. This new system connected them through dependency. And it was only just beginning. As the opium trade expanded, the consequences became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a controlled introduction was now a widespread problem. Addiction spread through different levels of society. Merchants, labourers, officials, even soldiers. Productivity declined. Social structures weakened. Silver, once flowing into China, now drained outward. The Qing dynasty could no longer treat this as a minor issue. It became a crisis. The imperial court had already issued bans on opium, but enforcement had been inconsistent. Now, the tone shifted. This was no longer about regulation. It was about elimination. In 1839, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu as a special commissioner, sending him to the southern port of Canton, the centre of foreign trade and the heart of the opium problem. His task was clear: end it. Lin Zexu approached the situation with determination and precision. He targeted both sides of the trade. Chinese users and dealers were pressured to surrender their opium. Foreign merchants were ordered to hand over their stockpiles, and this time, the order was enforced. After weeks of tension, negotiations and pressure, foreign traders complied. Over 20,000 chests of opium were confiscated. The scale was unprecedented. Then, in a public display of authority, Lin Zexu ordered it destroyed. The opium was mixed with lime and salt water, rendered unusable, and washed away. It was not just an act of enforcement, it was a statement, a declaration that the empire would not accept the continued presence of the drug within its borders. But this action had consequences. From the Qing perspective, it was a necessary defense of society and sovereignty. From the perspective of foreign traders, particularly the British, it was the destruction of valuable private property. And that difference in perspective mattered, because behind the merchant stood a government. The United Kingdom viewed the incident not just as a commercial dispute, but as a challenge to its economic interests and national authority. The opium trade, while controversial, had become integrated into its broader system of global commerce. And now, that system had been disrupted. The destruction of the opium did not end the trade. It escalated it. What had been a conflict over goods was about to become something larger, something that could not be resolved through negotiation alone. The routes that once carried trade were now carrying tension, and that tension was moving toward war. The destruction of opium at Canton did not end the conflict. It triggered it. What had been, until that moment, a tense but contained dispute between traders and officials now expanded into something far larger. Economic pressure turned into political confrontation, and political confrontation moved toward open war. In 1839, tensions between the Qing dynasty and the United Kingdom escalated beyond control. The British government responded not with negotiation, but with force. This marked the beginning of the First Opium War. For the Qing Empire, the conflict was unexpected in both scale and nature. China had long viewed itself as a dominant power in its region, accustomed to managing foreign relations on its own terms. The idea that trade disputes could lead to a full-scale military response from a distant power was not fully anticipated. But Britain operated differently. Its naval strength, built through years of expansion and technological development, allowed it to project power far from its own shores. Warships arrived along the Chinese coast, bringing a form of warfare that the Qing forces were not prepared to counter effectively. The imbalance was immediate. British ships, equipped with advanced artillery, could strike from a distance with precision. Chinese defences, designed for different kinds of conflict, struggled to respond. Coastal cities became targets. Strategic points along rivers and trade routes were seized. The war followed the same paths that trade had used. Ports, rivers, and commercial centres became military objectives. Control of these locations meant control of movement, of goods, of people, of influence. For the Qing Empire, the challenge was not just military, but structural. The systems that had once supported internal stability were not designed to confront an external force operating with different technology and tactics. Efforts to resist were made, but they lacked coordination and effectiveness against a highly organised naval campaign. As the conflict continued, the outcome became increasingly clear. This was not a balanced war. It was a demonstration of power, and that power forced a decision. By 1842, after a series of defeats and the continued pressure of British forces, the Qing government moved toward negotiation. The war had reached a point where continuation offered little chance of reversal. The Treaty of Nanjing followed. It marked the end of the conflict, but not the end of its consequences. What began as a trade dispute had reshaped the relationship between China and foreign powers. The Silk Road, once a network of exchange, had become something else entirely, a path not just for commerce, but for conflict. The war ended, but not in a way that restored balance. It ended with terms. In 1842, following defeat in the First Opium War, the Qing dynasty was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing with the United Kingdom. It was not a negotiation between equals, it was an agreement shaped by pressure. The treaty marked a turning point, not just for China, but for the entire structure of global trade. It did not simply end a war, it redefined how foreign powers would operate within Chinese territory. One of the most immediate changes was the opening of ports. Cities such as Shanghai, Canton, and others were designated as treaty ports, where British merchants could trade freely. These were no longer controlled entry points managed entirely by the Qing state. They became spaces of foreign presence, governed by new rules, and those rules were different. British citizens in these ports were granted extraterritorial rights. This meant they were not subject to Chinese law, but to their own. Legal authority, within certain areas, shifted away from the Qing government. Control, once centralized, began to fragment. The treaty also included the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. This provided a permanent base for trade and military presence, a foothold that extended beyond temporary access. Trade was no longer just passing through China. It was settling within it. Perhaps most importantly, the treaty altered the structure of commerce itself. Tariffs were fixed, limiting the Qing government's ability to control pricing and protect its own markets. Foreign goods could enter under conditions that favoured external interests. The balance of trade, already disrupted, shifted further. While the treaty did not explicitly legalise opium, it created conditions in which the trade could continue more openly. Enforcement became more difficult. Foreign merchants operated with greater security. The systems that had once attempted to restrict the flow of opium were weakened. And so the trade expanded. What makes this moment significant is not just the immediate impact, but the precedent it set. The Treaty of Nanjing was followed by additional agreements with other powers, each adding new concessions, new openings, new limitations on Qing authority. The structure established here became a model, one that would be repeated and expanded over time. China was no longer operating on its own terms. The doors had been opened, and they would not easily close again. After the Treaty of Nanjing, the structure of trade changed permanently. What had once been restricted, contested, and partially hidden now moved with increasing openness. The systems that had attempted to limit the flow of opium were weakened, and in their place emerged something far more difficult to manage: expansion. Foreign merchants operated with greater security. Treaty ports provided stable entry points. Legal protections reduced risk. And with reduced risk came increased volume. Opium did not just return to the market, it multiplied. By the mid-19th century, the scale of the trade had grown beyond what earlier officials had faced. What had once been measured in thousands of chests now reached levels that strained the ability of the Qing dynasty to respond effectively. The problem was no longer isolated, it was systemic. Addiction spread further into society, affecting not just individuals, but institutions. Officials tasked with enforcing restrictions were sometimes themselves involved in the trade. Corruption increased, enforcement weakened, the lines between legal and illegal blurred. The state still issued prohibitions, but prohibition without control is limited. Attempts were made to strengthen enforcement, to regulate ports more strictly, to limit distribution. Yet each effort faced the same obstacle. The trade was now embedded within a broader system of global commerce. It was no longer external, it was internal. At the same time, foreign demand for Chinese goods continued, and the economic incentives driving the opium trade remained strong. The system had reached a point where multiple forces, profit, dependency, and weakened authority, worked together to sustain it. Stopping it would require more than policy. It would require structural change, and that change was difficult to achieve. The Qing government found itself in a position where action carried consequences, but inaction carried others. Restricting trade risked further conflict with foreign powers, allowing it to continue deepened internal instability. There was no clear solution, only choices between difficult outcomes. This tension built over time. As the trade expanded, so did the pressure surrounding it. Economic concerns, social consequences, and political limitations all converged, creating a situation that could not remain stable indefinitely. The system had grown beyond control, and when systems reach that point, they tend to produce conflict. The routes that once carried exchange were now carrying imbalance, and that imbalance was about to escalate once again. The tension did not disappear after the First War. It deepened. What had been settled on paper through the Treaty of Nanjing remained unresolved in practice. Trade continued, opium expanded, and the imbalance between foreign powers and the Qing dynasty became more visible with each passing year. By the 1850s, the situation had reached another breaking point. This time, the trigger was smaller. An incident involving a Chinese-owned ship called the Arrow, registered under British authority, led to a dispute over legal jurisdiction. Qing officials boarded the vessel, arrested crew members, and lowered the British flag. From one perspective, it was an enforcement action within Chinese territory. From another, it was a violation of international agreements. That difference was enough. The United Kingdom, joined by France, responded with military force. What followed became known as the Second Opium War. Unlike the first, this conflict involved broader objectives. It was no longer just about trade, it was about access, influence, and authority. Foreign powers sought to expand the rights they had gained, to open more ports, to secure greater freedom of movement, and to establish diplomatic presence within China itself. The existing system, created after the First War, was no longer considered sufficient. Military campaigns once again followed the same routes that had supported trade. Coastal cities were attacked. Rivers became pathways for advancing forces. Strategic locations were targeted to weaken resistance and secure control. The Qing response faced the same challenges as before. Internal divisions, limited military modernization, and the scale of foreign power created a difficult position. Resistance was present, but coordination and effectiveness were inconsistent against forces equipped with advanced technology and supported by naval strength. As the war progressed, the pressure increased. Foreign troops advanced toward key political centers, demonstrating that the conflict was not limited to trade routes alone. It had reached the core of imperial authority. The outcome followed a familiar pattern. Defeat led to negotiation. The resulting agreements, the Treaty of Tientsin, and later the Convention of Peking, expanded foreign rights even further. More ports were opened. Diplomatic missions were established. Trade conditions were adjusted again. And this time, opium was legalized. What had once been contested, restricted, and fought over was now formally accepted within the system. The conflict had come full circle. Trade had led to war. War had reshaped trade, and the consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield. By the time the wars ended, the structure of trade had been transformed. But the deeper consequences were not measured in treaties or ports. They were felt in society. The expansion of the opium trade, combined with the outcomes of the conflicts, left lasting effects across the Qing dynasty. What had once been a controlled substance had become widely available, and its impact reached into daily life. Addiction was no longer limited to isolated groups. It spread across different levels of society, urban and rural, wealthy and poor. The effects were not always immediate, but over time they accumulated. Productivity declined in certain sectors. Households were affected. Resources that might have supported families or local economies were redirected. The consequences were gradual, but they were persistent. At the same time, the authority of the Qing state weakened further. The outcomes of the wars had introduced new pressures: foreign presence in key cities, limitations on control over trade, and legal structures that operated outside traditional systems. Governance became more complex. Officials had to navigate a system where foreign and domestic interests overlapped, often without clear boundaries. Enforcement of laws was no longer uniform. In some areas, authority remained strong. In others, it was fragmented. This inconsistency affected stability. Economic changes added another layer. The continued flow of silver outward, combined with internal challenges, contributed to financial strain. Local economies adjusted unevenly. Some regions adapted to new forms of trade, while others experienced disruption. The effects were not identical everywhere, but they were connected. Social tensions increased. The presence of foreign powers, the visibility of unequal agreements, and the internal consequences of the opium trade all contributed to a growing sense of imbalance. Resistance did not always take the form of direct conflict, but it existed in attitudes, in local actions, in broader movements that would emerge later. What becomes clear in this period is that trade was no longer just an external activity. It had become internal. Its effects were not limited to ports or markets. They shaped institutions, communities, and daily life. The Silk Road, in its earlier form, had connected regions through exchange. This new system connected them through consequence, and those consequences were not temporary. They would continue to influence the trajectory of Chinese society long after the trade itself had been established. By the end of the 19th century, the opium trade was no longer just a regional issue. It had become global. What began as a solution to a trade imbalance had evolved into a system that reshaped relationships between continents, economies, and empires. The routes that once carried silk and spices now carried influence, power, and conflict on a scale that earlier centuries had not experienced in the same way. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over decades, through trade, war, and negotiation. The outcomes of the Opium Wars and the treaties that followed did more than open ports or legalize commerce. They altered the structure of international relations. The Qing dynasty was no longer operating independently within its own framework. It had become part of a system shaped by external pressures and global competition. This shift extended beyond China. Other regions observed what had happened. The use of trade as leverage, the connection between commerce and military force, and the role of economic interests in shaping political outcomes, all became more visible. These patterns would influence how global powers interacted in the years that followed. Trade was no longer neutral. It was strategic. The legacy of the opium trade can be understood in multiple ways. Economically, it demonstrated how interconnected markets had become, linking production in one region to consumption in another. Politically, it revealed how economic interests could lead to conflict when control was challenged. Socially, it showed how external systems could reshape internal structures. But perhaps its most lasting impact was conceptual. It marked a transition. The earlier Silk Road had connected regions through exchange, often based on mutual benefit, even if imperfect. The system that followed was different. It was more complex, more structured, and more unequal. It reflected a world where connections still existed, but where power played a larger role in shaping how those connections functioned. The idea of a connected world did not disappear. It evolved. By the end of the 19th century, global trade networks were more extensive than ever before. Goods moved across continents and oceans with increasing regularity. Information travelled faster. Economies became more interdependent. But the lessons of this period remained. Connection can create opportunity. It can also create imbalance. The routes that once unified regions continued to exist, but they no longer represented the same kind of exchange. They had been reshaped, and the world, now more connected than ever, carried the consequences of that transformation forward.